Well, Liz, you brought up Chairman Mao. And Chairman Mao, it strikes foreigners when they come to China. They're not surprised to see his famous portrait at Tiananmen Square. Most people know that to expect it there. But they are often surprised to see the enduring statues of Chairman Mao in various parts of the country.
Especially in Shanghai.
Especially in Shanghai, for example. In many parts, out in,
Indeed.
if one goes to Kashgar, in the far northwest, on the old Soviet border, you have an enormous statue of Chairman Mao with his back to the Muslim city, facing Beijing. It's really quite a statement. You have, still on some university campuses, statues of Chairman Mao that tower over the campus. I once asked, this was some years ago, a Chinese university president, why do you still have a statue of Chairman Mao on your campus? And he said to me quietly, well, we missed our chance to take it down in the 1980s. So we don't see many statues of Lenin or Stalin in the former Soviet space, or in Eastern Europe, none at all virtually today. And yet we still see the founder of the People's Republic, who was himself a close follower of Stalinism in his youth, and followed many Soviet methods in establishing the country in the 1950s. You've written about images of a younger romantic Mao, the image of Mao at Anyuan, and have put it in the context of how one thinks of Mao in history and memory, but also in contemporary political terms. And I'd like you to comment a bit on this. First of all, this remarkable book that you've written on Mao at Anyuan, and then on what you think the lessons for that are for our contemporary understanding of China's understanding of Chairman Mao.
Well, of course, I'm always delighted to talk about my own work, and always delighted to talk about Anyuan, which is a somewhat obscure coal mine located in the middle of China, but happens to be a place where Chairman Mao, when he was very young, just beginning his revolutionary activities, was joined by several of the other early leading lights of the Chinese Communist Party, Liu Shaoqi, who later became Mao's competitor and rival and victim in the Cultural Revolution, Li Lisan, who was before Mao the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and so forth. So it was an amazing site of early communist labor mobilizing in the 1920s. One of the reasons that I enjoyed doing the study of Anyuan is that it did take me back to the very earliest days of the Chinese Communist Party, their very earliest and most idealistic moment, a period before there was a military force to actually support the Communist Party, and therefore the communists had to use their own charisma, charm, and the appeal of their message in order to mobilize people. They didn't have what Mao would later say is the basis of political power, namely the barrel of a gun. So it's a very interesting period, and in that early period, it was quite striking to me in studying the communist efforts at Anyuan, how creatively they used different elements of both Chinese and foreign cultural resources. So Mao and the others appeared as Confucian school teachers. Actually, Li Lisan, one of the early leaders of the party's father, was a Confucian degree holder, and he had been a Confucian school teacher before he went to Anyuan to teach the classics to the workers there. Mao himself was teaching in Changsha at the normal school as his day job. So these early communist leaders presented themselves really as teachers, as scholars, as part of a Confucian elite tradition, but also very, very creatively used a number of different elements of Chinese folk culture and folk tradition in order to inspire the workers and convince them that what they were doing, although it was, as you mentioned, in fact imported directly from the Soviet Union, that somehow it was in conversation with and resonant with certain traditions and strains in Chinese culture. It's been quite interesting. In recent years, there has been a kind of rediscovery of the romance of the young Mao in China, a rediscovery with the help of the Central Propaganda Department,
right.
Which has been centrally involved in producing a series of movies, television shows, and other media that highlight Mao's early activities. Before he became a revolutionary with a guerrilla army up in the mountains. And it's a picture of a young Mao that seems to have a lot of appeal to many people in China today, because it's a picture of a young Mao who was highly nationalistic, who was trying to mobilize ordinary Chinese for educational purposes initially. As I said, they went as school teachers and founded schools for workers, and then used those schools as a basis for a labor movement and for very gradually building communist cells among workers. In Mao's mind already, I think, was a kind of utopia of the Soviet Union and the hope that China could become another Soviet Union, but he immediately appreciated that it would be necessary to present this kind of message in a very Chinese way. And what's interesting about Mao, when you think about the demise of communism across Eastern Europe and so on, much of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe had to do with countries deciding that communism was really alien to their national traditions, and that their communist leaders were traitors to their national traditions. They were not reflective or representative of them. And in much of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, the collapse was according to kind of national or ethnic lines as people reclaimed a sense of their past and what they considered to be somehow their authentic history and their authentic culture. Mao, by having from the very beginning very consciously cultivated an image as a Chinese nationalist patriot, and then being, unlike in the former Soviet Union, not only the leader of the revolution, like Lenin in Russia, but also the leader of the communist state as it developed its sinews of power, like Stalin in the Soviet Union. Mao sort of combined in himself both the image of a young nationalist, revolutionary firebrand, and at the same time a mature communist leader who presided over a very powerful state. And so he is an image of nationalism to most Chinese. He is an image of Chinese strength. He is also an image of Chinese tradition, his propensity to spout earthy aphorisms when that seemed appropriate, his use of a Chinese calligraphy pen to write poetry when that seemed appropriate. He wielded a variety of cultural weapons that are associated with political power in the Chinese tradition. He did so very skillfully. And so his image, I would say, is an exceedingly complicated one in China. There are many intellectuals who detest him and everything he stands for. There are others, intellectuals, who think very highly of him and who, in my view, tend to romanticize many of his contributions in the Cultural Revolution and before that. Among ordinary people, the images are also quite mixed. Having done research for the last 6-7 years in Anyuan, which is really in the center of China proper, it was quite surprising to me when I first went there how, again and again, when people would first see a foreigner — I was the only foreigner that I ever saw wandering around Anyuan in the time that I was there — often the very first question would be, "What do you think of our chairman Mao?" That was what they were most proud of in Anyuan, and it was their chairman Mao because he had been there for a bit, and he was the one who had made Anyuan famous. And you can buy Mao paraphernalia all over the place. And I heard nothing but warm feelings for him on the part of poor people and on the part of quite well-off people alike. But I also spend a lot of time in the cities of China and on university campuses in China, and there you often find very, very different images of him. So it's a very complicated legacy, but I think it's a legacy that it's impossible for the current leadership in China to walk away from. That it was Mao's revolution that put a very strong Chinese Communist Party in place in China. And the current leadership, Xi Jinping, is a so-called princeling. He has his position because his father was a revolutionary comrade of Mao's. And for this generation of the children of the revolutionaries, their political legitimacy is very closely intertwined with and dependent upon that of the revolution and Mao as the acknowledged leader of that revolution. So I think it's a very complicated legacy, and it's different in different places. It's different among different age groups. It's different among different social classes. But it's also extremely different from the situation in the former Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. And therefore, I believe that looking at the history of the collapse of communism in those other regions of the world does not give us a very good handle on what's likely to happen in China.
I was thinking two thoughts came to mind as you were speaking. Of course, the kind of the hometown hero aspect in Anyuan, even though that wasn't really his hometown. It's an interesting thing when one thinks of different legacies in different parts of China. I was at Zhejiang University and was hosted by the Zhang Jieshi Yujindai Zhongguo Yanzhou Zhongxin, the Research Center for the Study of Chiang Kai-shek and Modern China. I was surprised to see this, but it was in Chiang Kai-shek's home province of Zhejiang, a remarkable research institution, and they took me to Chiang Kai-shek's hometown, a place that really was his hometown, Shiko, Fenghua, where he is, without question, a hero.
Indeed.
And indeed, this may not have happened to you at Anyuan. I actually met Chiang Kai-shek.
I met him too. I was just there in Fenghua myself more recently than you. I failed to have myself memorialized in this way, but I also did meet him and shook his hand.
Right, he's really still a formidable figure.
It's extraordinary that he's so well preserved and so vibrant, really.
Incredible. Really. He's actually looking better than Chairman Mao does under glass in Beijing. Chinese modern history is in many ways told, but not wrongly, as also the history of great personalities. What do you think might happen? One of the differences in the Soviet case and China's case, minimally, is, and I agree with you, the circumstances are quite different. But Khrushchev did denounce Stalin. There was a multi-decade process of de-Stalinization, which still the Soviet Union, and it would last another 30-something years after that, basically tried to survive without that central figure of its founding. What can we imagine are the possibilities when Chinese historians in China, not people like ourselves, can truly write the history of the purges of the early 1950s, the history of the anti-rightist movement in great detail, and above all the history of the Great Leap Forward with its perhaps 40 or more million deaths, even before the Cultural Revolution. This is a history of loss of life without parallel, even on the part of Stalin or Hitler, in terms of absolute loss of life. And what do you think that will be? I mean, what are some of the possibilities?
Well, I think precisely because, as you're suggesting, this history is so fraught with political danger for the legitimacy of the party, that kind of freedom to really explore and write objectively and without political restraint about the history of the party or about Mao's involvement in it is very unlikely to come in China and while the Communist Party is still in power. I think the Chinese Communist Party has reached the determination that Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in 1956 was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. Even though, as you mentioned, the Soviet Union continued still all the way up until 1991, But nonetheless, from the verdict that I believe has been embraced as the official verdict from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the real unraveling for the Soviet Union began with Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. You know, it was an electrifying moment around the communist world at the time. You had the Hungarian Revolution, you had uprisings in Poland and elsewhere. You had in China the 100 Flowers movement, which was Mao's response to what he saw as a crisis in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe of alienation between party and intellectuals, and an effort to overcome that. Of course, it didn't serve to overcome it, in his view, and then it was followed by the very brutal anti-rightist campaign where the state clamped down on those intellectuals who'd taken the invitation to speak their minds. But I think as the Chinese Communist Party looks at that history in the former Soviet Union, it views that denunciation of Stalin as a critical turning point that delegitimized the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And it has made a clear determination that it doesn't want to go down that path. So I really don't think we're going to get the kind of open history that you're talking about until the party is gone, or at least gone as being the only party in town. That's not to say that there isn't amazing scholarship being done by some very talented historians in the PRC today who are doing everything they can to push the envelope, who have access to archival materials that were unavailable in previous years, and who are using those archives and often oral histories and a whole variety of other sources to try to write as boldly as they can about the history of the PRC. But I don't really think that their work is going to play a major role in delegitimizing the party, because I think the party will maintain a very tight control over the publication of those kinds of materials.